Hey, what's up, everyone? This is TimJamz. Thanks for joining me today for Creation Week Chat, Impressions Part 3 of the Light on Day 1. We're going to be looking at the deliberations as we put the light on Day 1 on trial. Invite you along as the jury. I'm going to be putting on my jury hat. We're borrowing a page from J Warner Wallace, who wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. If you've not already read his book, I highly recommend that you read it and check it out. It's an awesome book. He is an apologist, public speaker, writer, former atheist who became a strong Christian. And in his career, he was a former detective who solved multiple cold cases, which were ones that were considered unsolved mysteries, sometimes went cold for decades. And he began to apply easy methods of reasoning, simple to understand, to look at the evidence. Sometimes there's only circumstantial evidence available in order to solve the mystery and close the case. And then as an atheist, he began to apply those same methods of reasoning to the Bible, the claims of Christianity, things like the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and he realized it was true. The evidence is true, and so he became a strong Christian, and he shares these methods of reasoning. And one of them, for example, he talks about is called abductive reasoning. He says most people use it every day. It's a process by which, let's say, for example, a friend walks into a room, and there's nobody else in the room, and they see a half-empty coffee cup on the table, and the coffee is still hot. He says the process of abductive reasoning is one in which the brain makes a mental checklist of the available evidence, the direct evidence at hand, which is the half-empty cup of coffee and the fact that it's still hot and there's no one in the room. And then the brain makes another checklist of possible explanations. How did the coffee get there? Why is it still hot? Why is it a half-empty cup? Why is there no one in the room? And then abductive reasoning is where the two checklists are compared and the plausible explanations are eliminated or taken away or removed because they don't fit the evidence at hand until only the most probable conclusion remains. So we might say it's unreasonable for there to be a half-empty cup of coffee on the table that's still hot unless someone was recently walked into the room drinking the cup of coffee, set it on the table, and then that individual left the room. And that leaves us what we call a reasonable certainty, or a certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now we have two different types of evidence that we're talking about, and as we look at the definitions of them, the first is direct evidence, usually that which speaks for itself, eyewitness accounts, for example, a confession or a weapon. And we don't have any weapons when it comes to Creation Week, fortunately. The other is circumstantial evidence, which is that which suggests a fact by implication or inference. It's a common misconception that many people have that circumstantial evidence is not valid to close a case. And the opposite is true. In real life, circumstantial evidence is sufficient. The reason why many people have this misconception, as J Warner Wallace describes, is that in many Hollywood films and TV shows, they show courtroom dramas that continually throw out cases due to insufficient circumstantial evidence. But in real life, he says if there's enough circumstantial evidence, if there is a great enough weight that the circumstantial evidence by itself can lead to a reasonable conclusion as to the truth of what happened, and that can be enough to solve the mystery and close the case. Now, when I talk about evidence in connection with Scripture, allow me to explain what I mean in my own personal thought model. When I say evidence regarding Scripture, I'm talking about passages that directly address the topic at hand as direct evidence. And when I say circumstantial evidence, I'm referring to scriptural passages that don't directly address the topic, but they contain key points that are like clues or puzzle pieces. They either hint or provide indirect evidence at what may have occurred, or they allow us to take away implausible explanations because they would conflict with that indirect evidence. If we want to think of an illustration of how circumstantial evidence works in real life, consider this hypothetical thought exercise with me for a moment. Imagine a trial by jury case in the 1920s where a candy bar was stolen from a nickel and dime store, but with no direct eyewitnesses to the crime. Suppose two people come forward with indirect evidence. Let's say the first person saw a potential suspect leaving the nickel and dime store around the time of the theft, didn't see their face, but observed them wearing green shoes. And let's say another eyewitness came forward, similarly did not catch a glimpse of the suspect's face, but saw them wearing a wristwatch. Now, would the two pieces of indirect evidence of the green shoes and the wristwatch be enough to identify the suspect and solve the mystery? Probably not. If those first two eyewitnesses were shown a lineup of potential suspects because they didn't catch a glimpse of the suspect's face, they more than likely would not be able to identify the suspect and solve the case, just based on those two pieces of indirect evidence. But now suppose that 4 more people came forward as eyewitnesses, and then 10 more, and each one had another piece of circumstantial evidence. For example, let's say someone saw a potential suspect getting into a getaway car, and they saw the license plate. And then let's say someone else observed that same car with that same license plate a couple blocks down the road from the nickel and dime store, rolled down the window and tossed out the candy bar wrapper, and they were able to retrieve the candy bar wrapper, and it matched the same kind of candy bar that was stolen from the nickel and dime store. If we consider all of the different circumstantial evidence available cumulatively, we may just be able to identify a suspect that fits all the evidence. If we can find a suspect that was wearing green shoes, that had a matching wristwatch, that was seen driving the car with the license plate that was observed, and then the candy bar wrapper that was seen thrown from the window of that same car matched the type of candy bar that was stolen from the nickel and dime store, we might be able to say, okay, yeah, we have enough circumstantial evidence now to make a reasonable conclusion, to have reasonable certainty that's established by the jury who renders the verdict, that can solve the mystery and close the case. Now, another brief note as we gather the evidence, it's important that we, as the jury and investigators, are gathering and researching the evidence neutrally during this evidence phase as much as possible to avoid drawing or forming premature conclusions, but to do our best to keep an open mind at this point in the investigation. We want to make sure that we don't inadvertently try to skew the interpretation of the evidence, either for or against premature conclusions that we may have formed, or that we don't overlook things that others might have missed as well. We're simply collecting data during this stage of research. And so I mention this because, as I had described earlier in the introduction to this impression series, I am heavily biased when it comes to the light on day one. However, having said that, as I've gone through and done my own research in Scripture to review the available evidence, to look at the passages that either directly or indirectly address the topic of the light on day one, I did my best to set my own biases aside temporarily, to keep an open mind, to have a healthy skepticism, and to try to look at the evidence neutrally. For this reason, let's also consider objections along the way to each passage of Scripture that we might consider as circumstantial evidence. And those objections are based on questions from an opposing viewpoint to see if we might be able to interpret the evidence differently, and whether those objections leave us with an interpretation that is reliable and valid, or if it may wind up not being sufficient to include in our evaluation. In order to arrive at the truth in 5 different categories, the truth must be feasible. It should have an explanatory viability. The truth will usually be straightforward. It demonstrates an explanatory simplicity. The truth should be exhaustive. In other words, there's no evidence left out, that the most reasonable explanation should account for all of the evidence that's available, and this is especially true in Scripture. The truth must be logical, or it must possess an explanatory consistency, and the truth will be superior. In other words, if there's multiple plausible explanations or thought models, the one that has an explanatory superiority is usually the one that points at the truth. All right, thanks for hanging with me today, and we'll have fun as we put on our jury hats. We begin our deliberations as to the light on day one. Catch you later.